It's my top albums of 2016 list, you guys. 2016 has been a pretty great year for music. There's been a lot of really great albums to come out this year. I'm not going to be covering all of them in this list. These are just the albums that I just kept coming back to time after time throughout the year. If you want a more extensive list of the really great albums that came out this year, I would check out Cover Killer Nation's top 50 albums of the year list that he has up on his channel. But as for me, I just wanted to keep my list short and sweet, so I'm only going to cover 12 of my favorites here. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. First up is King by Fleshgod Apocalypse. These guys are an orchestral metal band, and they really introduced me to this really cool subgenre of metal that combines death metal with classical orchestra, and it's really great sounding. These guys do a great job of blending both sounds almost seamlessly. And it's just a really bombastic and thematic album that I really enjoyed listening to. It's really surprising how well metal and classical music can mesh together to form something really unique and really gripping. I was really riveted by this album the first time I heard it, and it still really stands out to me at the end of 2016. Next up is Magma by Gojira. These guys are really unique bands that have been sort of blazing a trail throughout metal the past couple of years, and this album is no exception. It's really great. It's got a bunch of really catchy riffs on it. This album is a little bit more stripped down compared to the rest of their albums, but it's nonetheless really great. It's constantly stuck in my head throughout the year, and I had to keep returning to it. And for that reason, I just absolutely had to have it on this list. There were a lot of thrash metal albums to come out this year from really great bands. We had Anthrax release a new album. We had Metallica come out with their best album in years. We had Testament release a great thrash metal album. But for me, the best thrash metal album of 2016 comes in my list at number 10 with Megadeth's Dystopia. This album just was really great. It was far above the disappointment that was Super Collider, and it really takes their music back to their Rust in Peace days, back to the 90s and the 80s of Megadeth. And even though a lot of the other thrash metal albums that came out this year were great, this is the one that I returned to the most, and the one that I enjoyed most consistently when listening to the entire album. Coming in at number 9 is Chevelle's newest album, The North Corridor. This album really stepped it up from their last album. Their last album sort of picked up the pace in their discography. For a while now, they've been sort of mellowing out. Their last album sort of brought back some of the energy, brought back some of the heaviness of their old days. And this one takes it even further. This album is full of energy, it's full of vigor, even though it does sometimes get a little bit repetitive with the chorus and stuff in the songs. I just really, really loved the album. It just really satisfied my desire for the heavy side of Chevelle that we haven't been able to see in a really long time. At number 8, we have Ihsahn with Arktis. This is without a doubt one of the best albums of the year. It's on a lot of people's top lists, and for good reason. This is sort of black metal music, but it's very aware of itself. Ihsahn is a guy who likes to distance himself from his past albums and sort of branch out, and this album certainly does that. It encompasses a really wide range of sounds. There's a lot of different sounds on this album that still carry the same atmosphere and makes the album sound like a cohesive whole. It's a really great accomplishment. There's a lot of stuff that this album has to offer, and I don't want to spoil it at all. I just really highly recommend it because despite the variety of sound that you get on this album, it really still ties itself together with one cohesive theme and structure. And that's why I really loved this album. It really stood out to me. Next on the list, we have Vektor with Terminal Redux. Now, this is a band that likes to combine genres, especially death metal and thrash metal, to sort of a science fiction theme, and they're really good at doing it. This is the first album I've ever heard from them, and it's fantastic. It's really good. The instrumentality here is really great. You just have to listen to it for yourself. The vocalist is really unique. It's something that I had to get used to, but it sounds like if a xenomorph from Aliens decided to become the lead vocalist of a death metal band. It's really, really cool. The album is pretty chaotic, it's pretty relentless, but it's smart enough to throw in some melody and some variety in there every once in a while to keep it fresh and keep it interesting. And it all has a very cool, very consistent theme and atmosphere that you can get really sucked into. Coming in at number 6 is Opeth, Sorceress. This is a band that has a really wide range of sounds. They like to mix extreme melodic moments that are just really soft with really, really heavy moments, and they're really fantastic at doing that. It's an album that's really not afraid to be melodic, and a good chunk of its runtime is really soft and melodic, but just the way the music is crafted is so great. The way it blends this melody with the heavy metal parts is just fantastic, and it's just something that you have to listen to. It's a really unique experience that I absolutely loved. Coming in at number 5 on the list is Wanderer by Heaven Shall Burn. This album really took me back to my earlier days of being into metal, back when I was into bands like August Burns Red and The Devil Wears Prada really heavily. Those bands released albums that seemed really relentless, but had this sort of melody to it. And that's what I feel like this album has going for it. It's not metalcore. It's extreme metal, but it is really, really great. It's a really heavy, relentless album with some really, really great badass riffs on it, carrying that really heavy, relentless sound all the way through, yet having this sort of subtle melody throughout each song to keep it interesting and to keep it a little bit more varied than other albums would be. Coming in at number 4 is You Will Never Be One of Us by Nails. Man, this is a really, really relentless album. Imagine an album full of really short songs that are basically just breakdowns. Those breakdowns that you hear in songs and you're just like, oh yeah, it makes you want to mosh. Imagine if that breakdown was just one song. And you've got this album in a nutshell. It's a really angry, really ferocious album. It doesn't last any more than about 21 or 22 minutes. But man, is it a wild ride from start to finish. Most of the tracks don't even hit the 2-minute mark, save for a few exceptions. And it is just really, really good at being absolutely ferocious and unhinged in its brutality. But really, if you are a fan of relentless metal, of really high octane, ferocious stuff, then you've got to check this album out. It's really short, but it's super effective at what it does. We are now in the top 3 of my albums of 2016, and kicking off the top 3 at number 3 is Babymetal with Metal Resistance. Now, this band came out a couple of years ago to some real controversy, but their last album I was a big fan of, even though it wasn't flawless. It had some big problems. This album really, really improved upon their sound. It took things that I didn't like and that didn't work about the last album and totally threw them out the window. This band has definitely matured since their debut album. There's a lot of throwbacks and a lot of references and a lot of homages to other bands on this album that you're definitely going to be able to recognize. This album honestly has some of my all-time favorite songs of this year on it, especially with the last 3 tracks of this album. There were really a lot of surprises on this album, and the album really surpassed my expectations. If you're somebody who was skeptical of Babymetal at first, maybe you didn't like their last album and the stuff they put out on this album, I would definitely recommend you checking this one out, especially the last 3 songs on the album, because it's really outstanding. You can tell these girls really did their homework to make a great metal album. My number 2 album of 2016 is The Violent Sleep of Reason by Meshuggah. These guys are fantastic at doing what they do. They pioneered the genre of gent, and they're back with a vengeance this year to just give us another fantastic album. It's almost like these guys can't put out anything bad. This album has a really angry, ferocious, raw sound that comes from the fact that they recorded it live in the studio as opposed to their last few releases. They recorded it with 16-string guitars. It's definitely the heaviest album of the year. It's absolutely bonkers, the things that they do in this album, the technicality of it, the riffs, the grooves. And speaking of theme and atmosphere that I've been referencing in some of the other albums, this album has it in spades. Such a great atmosphere this album has consistently throughout its runtime. It's just an album that I had to keep coming back to, and an album that I listened to as a whole more than almost any other album this year on this list. I hardly have problems with this album. It's just fantastic. And it would be number one if the next album on this list had never been released. Because as much as I listened to this album, as much as I loved this album, it pales in comparison to number one. Winter's Gate by Insomnium. It's hard to really say how much I love this album when there really hasn't been an album that's had this kind of effect on me in a really, really long time. This album is composed of one single 40-minute long song, and when I heard that this was going to be happening, I really didn't know what to expect, because some bands have done this and it's been great, and other bands have done this and it's really just been a flop and didn't work. And Insomnium shows us how to do a really long song, not only well, but perfectly. This album is absolutely flawless. It is one of the most engrossing, gripping musical experiences of this year. This album just doesn't give you fantastic music to listen to. It gives you an experience. It paints an entire world that you can just get lost in. The lyrics and concept of this album is based on a short story of the same name, and you can tell the musicians were just really inspired by this story because the music and just the way everything fits together really pulls you in and really sucks you in. This is not an album to be listened to casually. It's not an album to be turned on when you're doing something else. When you turn this album on, it captures your full attention. It brings you into a world of blood and steel. With a lot of things, there's a certain amount of hype that accompanies them. And once this hype dies down, people start to see things for what they really are, and they start noticing flaws. But there's really no unnecessary hype with this album. Every time I turn it on, every time I start to listen to it, I'm ready to be thrown back into this universe that this music has built. This is, without a doubt, Insomnium's greatest work. And without a doubt, my favorite album of 2016. This album has only been out for a couple of months, but I've listened to it probably hundreds of times. Every time I start to listen to this thing, I want to listen to the entire thing, all 40 minutes. Like I said, it's not just music, it's an experience. The experience of seeing a world created in front of you that's so real you can almost touch and feel. It's fantastic, and I highly recommend it above all the other albums that I've talked about in this video. Well, that concludes this list of my favorite albums of 2016. What were your favorite albums of 2016? There were a lot of really great albums that I didn't mention here, but definitely are worthy of being listened to. And like I said in the beginning of the video, if you want a more extensive list of albums that came out this year that were fantastic, go check out on Cover Killer Nation's channel the top 50 albums of 2016. This list was definitely hard to make. It was a super competitive list. All of these albums really deserve really high praise, and it was hard to really get the list in a satisfying order that I was okay with. I hope you guys check at least some of these albums out because they deserve to be listened to. So I'll see you next time. Until then, you guys just keep it metal.
What?
I'm busy.
What?
Bother me about lunch some other time.
But
you're on video.
I don't care. I want nuggets.
Then go in the refrigerator and get a freaking chicken patty.
I want nuggets.
We don't have nuggets.
I want nuggets.